Good evening and welcome to Electoral Redistricting 101. My name is Shannon Rowan and I am the Program Director for Civic Outreach at the Center for the Study of Government and the Individual here at UCCS. And I'll be serving as your moderator for tonight's conversation. This event has brought together a number of collaborators across UCCS, the College of Letters, Arts and Sciences, GeoCivics, the Center for the Study of Government and the Individual, and of course our host, UCCS Downtown. And we shared a purpose that is twofold. The first, to answer the hows and whys of the redistricting process. And our second goal, to hopefully inspire everyone to leave tonight's event with a desire to learn more and hopefully get involved. As the Program Director for CSGI, my work centers mostly on the Constitution. So you may be asking yourself, what does the Constitution say about electoral redistricting? Well, not very much. In fact, the framers only wrote about 3 sentences to really encapsulate what we're going to be talking about here tonight. So to quote Article 1, Section 2, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers. Of course, they included some specifics, that enumeration would occur every 10 years, and that the number of representatives shall not exceed 1 to every 30,000 individuals in the United States. But of course, every state must have at least 1 representative. Though brief, these 3 sentences in Section 2 continue to impact critical issues that we face as a nation. For our purposes today, we will be exploring what electoral redistricting means for us here in the state of Colorado. And our first speaker brings a wealth of experience to do just that. Jeremiah Berry Esquire is an Assistant Director and Team Leader in the Office of Legislative Legal Services with the Colorado General Assembly, where he has worked for 25 years. This year, he will also serve as the Managing Attorney for the new Colorado Independent Redistricting Commission. Mr. Berry, thank you so much for joining us virtually tonight to discuss both the history of redistricting in the state of Colorado and our current process.
Thank you very much for that introduction. As Shannon said, I've been asked to give a brief history of redistricting in Colorado and how it might have influenced how it's to be done under the new amendments Y and Z that we'll be using for the first time. So I'll start with the history of redistricting in Colorado. And as many of you know, starting in the 1960s, there were a number of Supreme Court cases that really changed the landscaping of redistricting. So I'm going to start with 1972, which was an important year. That is after the effect of those initial cases were felt. And 1972 was also the last time that a redistricting bill was passed in Colorado and signed by the governor without the involvement of courts. Now, it is probably not a coincidence that 1972 is also the last time that redistricting was done when one party controlled both houses of the General Assembly and the governorship in Colorado, and therefore was in complete control of the process. But since then, we've never had that, and courts have been involved. And as a consequence, we haven't experienced the extreme gerrymandering that has appeared in other states. But there certainly has been some political gerrymandering in Colorado. And I'm going to start with talking about congressional redistricting because after 1972, they were sort of split into 2 different processes. This is the constitutional provision that was in place prior to Amendments Y and Z. And as you can see, like in most states, the General Assembly was responsible for doing the redistricting in Colorado, and the General Assembly acts by passing a bill that is signed by the governor. But starting in 1975, we had a string of 24 years with Democratic governors who vetoed all of the redistricting bills passed by the Republican-controlled General Assembly. And then we had two redistricting cycles when the control in the General Assembly was split between the two houses. And in those two cycles, no redistricting bills were even passed by the General Assembly. So on all four times, it ended up going to court. And another point I should make at this point is that the Constitution, as you see, doesn't have any criteria for drawing districts. So the courts were really on their own for what they would use to compare plans and decide what plan was better than another one. So most recently, in both 2001 and 2011, the cases went to trial in Denver District Court. The process was some testimony was taken. Parties to the lawsuits submitted proposed maps and plans, oftentimes based on how things were going in the trial. Those maps and plans were then amended and changed, but each time the real plans that the court was considering were being drawn by the political parties. So there really was very little compromise in those lawsuits. Ultimately, the court was just choosing either a map that had been drawn by the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And ultimately, both times in 2001 and 2011, the court approved a map proposed by the Democratic Party. So the Republican Party was certainly ready to have a change in the way congressional districts were redone. Now, it may seem to you that it should have been easier for the parties to reach a compromise. I mean, they knew, since they didn't control the whole process, that they had to enter into a compromise. But I think that reflects sort of the way things are done in political parties. Every time you would have agreed to a compromise, you would have been hurting a member of your own caucus, or at least a candidate to become a member of your own caucus. So for party unity, maybe it was easier not to agree to any compromises and let the courts make the decision. Of course, the courts really aren't interested in making these decisions because they know they're extremely political, and however they rule, they're going to be criticized by the other party. Now, I told you, because of this lack of unified control, we didn't have, or we haven't had, the extreme gerrymandering that we've seen in other states. This is a map of the 7th district in Colorado. Others have said that this is the most gerrymandered congressional district in Colorado, but actually the south and eastern border of this follows exactly the outline of the city and county of Denver. So I don't know that you can say that's been gerrymandered terribly. Now, what portions of Adams County and Arapahoe County were included in it may have, there may be some political gerrymandering in choosing those, but you will see that it's not nearly as gerrymandered as districts in other states. This is a district from North Carolina, and North Carolina's districts and Maryland's districts were the two states that were before the United States Supreme Court in the case where they recently held that political gerrymandering was a non-justiciable issue. That is, federal courts were not to consider political gerrymandering cases at all. The couple of interesting things about this case, first, are this district. First off, it ended up being thrown out by the state courts in North Carolina as being contrary to the North Carolina Constitution. The second thing that I'd like to point out about it is it is actually very remarkably similar to an earlier district that was drawn with the intent of creating a majority-minority district composed of African Americans. So I think two things from that. One is not all strangely shaped districts are really shaped that way for political purposes. It may involve racial considerations, racial and ethnic considerations. And secondly, sometimes drawing a district to favor one party or the other mirrors very closely to the way that a district drawn to protect a minority group may be there. This is another famous or maybe infamous district. This is out of Illinois and known as the earmuff district. But again, this was drawn for minority reasons. The central part of this map and the earmuff is an African American district, and the earmuff itself is a district composed of Spanish speaking and Latino interests. And here's a district from Maryland. Again, this is one of the districts that was before the United States Supreme Court. And the only reason I think I can come up with for why this district appears the way it does, is political reasons. Now, it may appear that it is not even contiguous, but actually the portions that are non-contiguous are bodies of water, so they are considered contiguous. And just to show you that people who deal with redistricting have a sense of humor, some people created a font like Arial or Times New Roman, and all of the alphabet is created by congressional districts in the United States. You will notice that the U for the letter U is actually that earmuff district that I showed you earlier. So again, in Colorado, to get a plan approved by the court, they couldn't have drawn districts this way. But again, the maps were drawn by the political parties, so they clearly favored one political party and another. Now turning to the state legislative districts. In 1974, there was a constitutional amendment passed by the voters that created a new commission. Colorado was actually one of the first states to have a commission draw districts. It was limited to state legislative districts because at that point there was some question whether a commission could draw congressional districts. And you will see it's also called a reapportionment commission, but they were all single member districts. So it was really misnamed a reapportionment commission. It should have been a redistricting commission. And you can see it is composed of 11 members. 4 members would be appointed by the legislative department, 4 by the executive department, and 4 by the judicial department. The other issue here was the political makeup of it. Again, it was an 11-member commission, no more of 6 of whom shall be affiliated with the same political party. Now, I'm not great at math, but even I know that 6 is a majority of an 11-member commission. Consequently, one party was generally in control of the commission and able to draw the legislative boundaries that favored that, that party. So in 1981 and 1991, there was a majority of Republicans on the commission, and they were able to draft plans that favored them. In 2001, as might have been expected, the Republican governor appointed 3 Republicans to the commission. The final 4 are chosen by the Chief Justice of the Colorado Supreme Court. And the Chief Justice was criticized harshly because she, in fact, appointed 4 Democrats to the commission, giving the Democrats a majority in 2001. In 2011, the Chief Justice and the governor, I think, got together to avoid that criticism. So the Democratic governor, in fact, appointed 1 Republican and 2 Democrats, and the Chief Justice then appointed 2 Republicans, 1 Democrat, and 1 unaffiliated member. So in 2011, the commission was actually composed of, 5 Rs, 5 Ds, and an unaffiliated member. So you would have thought maybe there could be a compromise out of that. Unfortunately, what really happened with that commission in 2011 was, again, the political parties were the ones who were drawing the maps and proposing the maps. And the unaffiliated member was simply choosing between the maps drawn by one party or another party, similar to the way the judges in the congressional redistricting was done. And in 2011, again, that unaffiliated commissioner chose the Democratic plan that was finally adopted by the commission. Now, fortunately, the drafters of that constitutional amendment that created the commission provided some more safeguards. They did have and specified criteria for drawing the legislative districts that you could compare plans to. And then the final thing that they added was, once the commission approved a plan, it went to the Colorado Supreme Court. And in the Colorado Supreme Court, ultimately, they were the ones who had the final approval of the plan, and parties were able to file objections to it and proceed that way. And in fact, all 4 of the commissions that were formed in the last 40 years, every one of them had their initial plans rejected by the Colorado Supreme Court. So that's a history of how things had been done in the past. Let's see how things may change in the with the new one. The first thing is, and I think I jumped a slide here. Let me go back. First, you will notice that the composition of the commission, there will be 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 4 unaffiliated people to give further emphasis to the unaffiliated people to approve the final plan. It requires a vote of at least 8 of the 12 commissioners, and including the affirmative vote of 2 of the unaffiliated commissioners. Now, I think this provision may have come from commissions in another state. I think the reason you're requiring 2 unaffiliated commissioners is you don't want the 2 political parties to get together and design something that will keep all of the incumbents in districts that they could be reelected from. Given the history of redistricting in Colorado, I don't think that was likely to happen in Colorado anyway. The next thing that I would point out is that how they're selected, how the members of the commission are selected is extremely important. Indeed, about 1/3 of the language of each of the amendments Y and Z is devoted to appointing the commission members. So they are, it's no longer the governor and the legislative leaders and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So first off, anyone can apply. You don't have to know someone to get appointed, as you did in the past. Now there are qualifications. You must have voted in the last two general elections. You must have been registered with your party, either a Democrat or Republican, for at least 5 years, or you must have been unaffiliated for at least 5 years. And there are certain things that would disqualify you as being a member of the commission. If you ran for office, or you worked for a candidate or a candidate's committee, or if you had been a professional lobbyist, you're not permitted to be a commissioner. So there's a very complicated process for appointing all 6 commissioners. I will just point out, as you can see on the slide, that the first 6 commissioners will be chosen by lot. There's going to be a random drawing of people. So we have no idea exactly what their qualifications are going to be, or how that's going to work, but that is where we are currently in the process. So on February 1st, the first 6 members of the Congressional Commission will be appointed. And on February 12th, I think it is, the first 6 members of the State Legislative Commission will be appointed. And you can see the first 6, there will be 2 unaffiliated, 2 Rs and 2 Ds. And those 6 have to be each from a different current congressional district. So we will have a variety of people from a variety of areas of the state at least. Now, after that, the majority leader and minority leader of both the House and Senate are each entitled to submit pools of 10 people to a judicial panel that is made up of retired judges from the Colorado Court of Appeals. And they will be involved in choosing the final 6 members of the commission. They will draw 1 from each of the 10 pools of 10 of the legislative leaders, and then 2 more who are unaffiliated to get the 4 Rs, 4 Ds, and 4 unaffiliated members. And there's the provision for them choosing the final 6 members. And the next thing they did, trying to get away from having the political parties draw the plans, the commission starts by nonpartisan staff alone being the ones who draw a preliminary plan. And the preliminary plan will then be taken around the state for public hearings that I'll talk about a little bit more later. When we come back from those public hearings, nonpartisan staff shall prepare, publish, and present to the commission no fewer than 3 staff plans. And we can and will take direction from the commission as to how those plans should be drafted, so they won't be completely, it won't be completely up to the nonpartisan staff. And if the commission does approve, the first or second plan, we don't have to, present a third plan. But the final kicker is, if the commission that is not able to approve a plan by a date certain in the Constitution, then nonpartisan staff is to submit its 3rd unamended plan to the Supreme Court as the plan for the commission. Now, I think there should be some more talk today about the public's involvement, and there will be a lot of public involvement in this process, hopefully more than we had with the old reapportionment commissions. Any Colorado resident can present a proposed map and comments about maps that are being proposed. And here's where we get to, we have to have at least 3 public hearings in each of the existing 7 congressional districts. And even with the COVID issues that we're having now, our plan is to hold public hearings in each of the congressional districts. We will have those both streamed and available for people to make their comments either remotely or in person. And the commissioners will be allowed to attend either in person or remotely. And we're required to then have a recording of all of those public hearings and post that on the website of the commission. And again, on that website, we're supposed to post all of the maps and comments that we receive. Again, trying to get as much public interest and input for the commissions as possible. So that is a brief history and how we're getting to, how we may be proceeding on with the new amendments Y and Z. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have at this point.
Jeremiah, thank you so much for your comments. We do actually have a few questions from attendees tonight. The first is, where can we find the alphabet you added in your presentation? And can you recommend any other sources for satire? It's not often that you can make redistricting a lighthearted endeavor, right?
Well, I'm sorry, I just heard the first part. I think that font is called Ugly Jerry with a G. Ugly Gary or Jerry. So you can download that for free, I believe. So that's.
I'll be typing all my emails tomorrow. Thank you for that. A second question, is your presentation available anywhere for public viewing? We will be making this presentation available, so you can certainly revisit what Jeremiah shared with us tonight. And it looks like, is there, another question, is there another state with an independent commission similar to what we have here in Colorado?
Yes, there are. I know, and each state is a little bit different. I think the appointment process in Florida is very similar to what it is in Colorado, but it may actually be an advisory commission rather than one that has the final say. I know Arizona has a redistricting commission, and it is composed of 2 R's, 2 D's, and the 4 of them are to get together and appoint a 5th, who is theoretically more unaffiliated. California also has a redistricting commission that I think is maybe most similar to what we do in Colorado.
Wonderful, thank you. Jeremiah, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us tonight. He will be staying with us through the rest of the event. So if you have any additional questions that pop up as we hear from our other panelists tonight, please feel free to add them into the chat box, and we will get back to them as we wrap up the session. We are very fortunate to have our second speaker joining us tonight, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dwayne Liller. He serves as the GIS and data technician in El Paso County Clerk and Recorder's Office for elections. Dwayne also recently completed his master's in geography in 2020 here at UCCS, where his research focused primarily on redistricting. His master's thesis is titled, "The Impact of Competitive Congressional Districts on Compactness and Political Subdivision Splits in Colorado." And he's going to explain to us what that means tonight. So we are very, very fortunate to have Mr. Liller here, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the role communities of interest play in the redistricting process and how those communities are prioritized. Dwayne, thank you so much for joining us.
The microphone is yours, sir.
Okay, let's see if I can get my slides playing here. And by all means, if you don't see them, yell at me right away. So in brief, I'm going to talk to you about traditional districting principles and Colorado districting principles, how they're alike, how they differ. We'll focus a little bit on conflicting criteria as we try to to draw these districts and a prioritization scheme to overcome those conflicts. Hopefully we have a bunch of students online with us. I'm going to give you a couple of possible research topics concerning communities of interest. We'll talk about a little bit in depth, and then how do we operationalize that competitive district criteria that is new to Colorado. And then I'm going to wrap up with the missing ingredient on all this that probably gets some people laughing a little bit. We'll see. Jerry summed this one up pretty nicely. We have apportionment. We do a census count, and then based on the new populations, a new apportionment comes out. Big math model assigns how many seats we have. In Colorado, it's pretty exciting. We're projected to get an additional seat. I don't know if that's going to be true yet. We'll have to wait and see those numbers. But then it's time to redistrict. And so states are actually responsible for their own districts. And the question becomes, how then do they do that? And the standard answer is using traditional districting principles. And I'll just give a very brief definition of each of them because I want to move on to some other things. So those traditional principles are equal population. It's exactly as it sounds. If you have 7 districts, they should contain very nearly equal populations. Contiguity, Jerry touched on that one nicely. A section of area has to be all one, not divided up. He showed a great map of if there's water features, then sometimes you can have contiguity, even though it looks like those areas are separated. Compactness, it's just the smallest shape or the most compact shape, something like a circle or a square, just to keep from getting those snake-like, and again, Jerry showed us a great picture of those. Racial equity is really in line with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, not diluting minority voters. Preserving communities of interest and political subdivisions. Communities of interest we'll talk more about in a minute. Political subdivisions, if you're talking about congressional districts, then you'd be talking about things like counties and cities and towns. And so the idea in preserving those subdivisions is to try not to split them if you can avoid it. And then finally, of the traditional principles is protect the incumbent and prior district cores. So a brief question is, where do these districting principles come from? And the simple answer is malfeasance and attempts to make districts that were in no way fair led to responses of trying to force people to follow some rules and make districts that were a little more fair. Equal population, we've probably all heard back in the 1960s around the civil rights era, you get 10,000 people in one district, 50,000 in another. That's obviously not proportional representation. Compactness, it's one of those things that tries to overcome the tortured shapes that Jerry showed us some good maps of. And then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, trying to attain racial equity, was a response to poll taxes, grandfather clauses, literacy tests, things like that to try to disenfranchise voters. So most of these principles came about to try to thwart political manipulation and introduce some fairness. So we'll look at Colorado districting principles. That list should look very, very similar. It'll be easier if I put them side by side for you. And they are the same until you get down to the bottom in the red text areas. Colorado says to not protect the incumbent. That's a departure from the traditional principles. And also protecting prior district cores is not required. And we introduced in 2018 with amendments Y and Z a new criteria that is to make districts competitive. So there's actually a challenge in applying the traditional principles or even Colorado's principles that depart from them, and that is that these principles conflict with one another. And what that means is if you're trying to meet one, you may very well violate another in the process. And this, of course, opens the door for some nefarious activity if one chooses to walk through that door. Here's what I mean about conflicting principles. So imagine you're trying for equal population and also to preserve those subdivisions like counties, towns, and cities. Well, at some point, the requirement for equal population will actually force you to split a county, city, or town. Another example, I'm glad that we're all using Denver as an example here. This is not a compact shape. It is the city and or county of Denver. So I can preserve the political subdivision, which is Denver, but is obviously not a compact shape. So these are just two examples of how all of the principles can rub up against each other and actually make it difficult to comply with all of them at once. So the question becomes, how are we to use these principles at all? And the answer, which comes largely from court cases, and I'm talking here specifically about Colorado, is to use a hierarchical approach. And I call them mandatory, as able, and thereafter. And let me break those down for you and you'll see what I mean. So the mandatory criteria is to comply with equal population, contiguity, and the Voting Rights Act. So we're going to do those no matter what. Then the wording is to, as much as is reasonably possible, will preserve those communities of interest, the political subdivisions, and make those districts compact. And then the wording becomes thereafter, and to the extent possible, will make them competitive. And then finally, let's not forget about those things that we're not supposed to do, which is protect incumbents or dilute minority voting power. So here's the criteria to work with. We're going to do the mandatory items. We're going to be sure to avoid the forbidden items. But right here in the middle, this is the criteria that we're going to kind of work with as we're drafting our districts. But there's a catch to it all. And this is where we're going to talk about communities of interest a little bit. I'm not going to read this whole list, but all of this is from the literature review. This is from Arrington in 2010, about things that might make up a community of interest. So look that over and see how broad that is. And you have to ask yourself, what is not included in a community of interest? It's very difficult to define. So given the ill-defined nature of it, and by the way, the Colorado Constitution adds even more to that list and actually does not help clarify it in any way. But one of the things you'll find in the literature is that one of the ways to attack communities of interest is to combine it as a political subdivision. In other words, treat political subdivisions as if they are a community of interest. And the benefits of that approach, and I'm not saying this is the only approach, but if you do that, the rationale is this. If I live in the town of Woodland Park and you live in the town of Woodland Park, we share the same police, our kids probably go to the same schools. In the summer, when all of the campers drive through town and clog the traffic, we all put up with that together. We go to the same churches. And so the point is that if you can't identify communities of interest otherwise, you can treat preserving political subdivisions as a surrogate for also protecting those communities of interest. So that's one approach. But we're going to consider these a little more closely. And this is one of the ways that was talked about and will be talked about more is the public participation. Now, I'm going to talk about public participation only in terms of the communities of interest. Obviously, I support public participation. I think public participation is a wonderful thing. But with regards to communities of interest, I want to know who shows up to identify themselves as a community of interest. The answer is probably organized groups. So by the nature of their being organized, does that mean they're politically motivated? Do they already have an agenda? Are they going to be the loudest voice in the room and thus appear as a community of interest? And what I really want to know is who doesn't show up? And of course, the answer is everybody else. So I wonder, and I can't prove this, but I wonder, are we going to overlook as many communities of interest as we might identify? And the reason I bring this up is I think there's a better way. And the better option, and this is a research opportunity for all you students out there, we should identify communities of interest ahead of time instead of waiting until a redistricting year and then trying to solicit input. I'd like to see scholars, and this could be scholars statewide from various disciplines and from various colleges, kind of start working on this and put together definitions of communities of interest and actually identify them. What I'd like to see, and perhaps in collaboration with the State Demography Office, I'd like to have this as a GIS data set. And so communities of interest are ready. It's time for all of us to go out and redistrict, whether at the county level or the state level or whatever it might be. And we can grab those communities of interest instead of just relying on the politically organized groups that show up. And then we get to the thereafter, finally to the point of making competitive districts. And we're going to consider this a little bit more closely as well. So this is from my research into this. In the literature review, the most common cited definition of competitive was a win margin within 10% and or whether it was a contested election. I've since come to find that to be inadequate. And the reason being that a 10% margin could lock in a gerrymander forever and you'd have a partisan district for the rest of your life. And the reason that 10% is further no longer adequate, or at least not adequate here in Colorado, is that we have new wording, which is that a competitive district would have a reasonable potential for the party of the district's representative to change over the life of that map. In other words, it should change party hands. And so there's your research opportunity yet again. What is that? So is that going to be a win margin? If so, is it 10%? Is it 7? Is it 3? Does anybody know? How do we factor in voter turnout? Is it even important? And how do we know from year to year what voter turnout will be? So essentially, what are the actual variables and thresholds that will help the map makers decide that that district may actually change hands over the life of the map between censuses? So that's, if I were in grad school right now, I would actually want to look at this and see, is there a way to identify this and help the redistricting commission? So here's a quick review. We looked at traditional principles versus what Colorado has. The difference is that Colorado says we don't need to protect the incumbent or the district core. And then thereafter, we'll finally draw those competitive districts, which is new to Colorado. We know that these principles are conflicting, and the way to get through them is the hierarchical approach of prioritizing one over the other. And then hopefully I've inspired a few of you for research topics to ID those communities of interest and maybe metrics for what Colorado's definition of competitive will actually be in order to change party control. So here's the magic missing ingredient, and that is political will. And this is a commitment to fairness and the democratic process. So recall just briefly that many of these criteria, these districting principles, came about because there were bad actors involved in the first place and they didn't want a fair process. And so one by one, we see the bad districts, we make a rule to try to prevent it, and then there's just another way to wiggle around it, and then you get another rule. So first we make equal population. Well, they wiggle around that, and then we have to try to say that you have to make them compact, or you know, the list goes on, all in an effort to make maps fair. And I would argue that without an objective, or without a commitment to fair maps from the beginning by the people making them, you can actually use these conflicting criteria to justify just about anything you want after the fact. For example, I would say, well, there's a community of interest here, and so that's why we have to have the district lines where they are, or political subdivisions have to be divided because of complying with the Voting Rights Act. So I would say the most important element is actually just being committed to fair maps to begin with. And that is the end of my presentation. I've got some funny maps after this, but I'll just open it up for questions now.
Thank you so much for your comments. We do have a few questions for you. What kind of changes did you see in redistricting since the Voting Rights Act was overturned in 2013, if any?
Well, I didn't actually look at that specifically. In fact, I'd bump that probably over to Mr. Berry rather than me in terms of the legalities of it. Yeah, I'm afraid with my research, I didn't really look at that at all. I wouldn't be able to tell you too much about that.
Jeremiah, is that something that
Be able to shed some light on?
I would say only generally. I think, I mean, and I think this is just anecdotally, some of the redistricting in the South has not protected minority interests as much as they had based on Section 5. But I think, you know, the full impact of that may not be felt until this round of redistricting. So I'm not certain we've seen exactly what the ultimate result of that Section 5 being found unconstitutional until this round of redistricting. It may show up more now.
Thank you so much for that. If there are no other questions, I'll pause just for a quick second. It looks like we have one more. Thank you. Dwayne, do you have any opportunities for interns or service learning projects in your office? And if not, if you might have any suggestions of where students could look, that would be very much appreciated.
That is a great question. And I'll tell you, I was the last intern in my office and now I work there. So sadly, I think I took that position. Currently, I don't know of any, but I would say, keep working with the faculty there at the college. They were the ones who actually hooked me up. So it's a big area. There's probably other opportunities out there. In fact, I think Sarah Johnson might even have some ideas at the city level, but none that I know of. But I'd say, keep working with the college and just keep your eyes open.
Fantastic, thank you. That's a wonderful segue to our next speaker. We are very fortunate to have Sarah Bald Johnson joining us tonight. Sarah has been the city clerk for the city of Colorado Springs for the last 8 years with a number of responsibilities, but the one that brings her here tonight is that she is responsible for the redistricting of city council districts, which was recently completed. Ms. Johnson is going to talk to us a bit about that process, some of the lessons learned, and what we can all take away from that as we move forward with the redistricting in 2021 for our congressional and county districts. So Sarah, thank you for joining us. They are all yours.
Thank you. I enjoyed the 2 presentations ahead of me, so thank you. I got a little educated on my new home state of Colorado. As Shannon said, I've been here 8 years. I was in Kentucky before doing statewide redistricting, so I totally understand what everyone's going to be getting into, and on the county level also. So let's talk a little bit about what we have done in the city of Colorado Springs. So our city charter, which is like our local constitution, so to speak, requires the city clerk to redraw those boundaries every 4 years in the even year before the odd year election. And so I also have a deadline date to get that done, which is at least 120 days, but not more than 150 before the election. So our election, for those of you that live in the city of Colorado Springs, please put on your calendar April 6, 2012. This year, April 6, we're going to mail out ballots March 12th. You'll be getting a ballot with your respective city council district race on it and 1 city question. So stay tuned for that, and remember always to vote and register if you're not. So our charter and city code set forth the district maps. This is a little repetitious, have to be equal in population, contiguous, comply with the Voting Rights Act. What's interesting about our city charter is our plan, the redistricting final maps, are not approved by city council or by the mayor. That power rests with the city clerk. So the process for the city clerk is releasing a preliminary report, which is like a draft map to get those comments on, conduct public hearing on that draft map, and then prepare a final district report. That's what the city charter states. So right after the 2012 redistricting, one of the suggestions that city council had was, we know that's what the city charter has, and the city charter, to have that amended, you have to do a vote of the people. So what they did in lieu of that was create some city code that works and corresponds with the city charter, and that process was to create a process advisory committee. And their role was to oversee the public input process that goes into redistricting, educate the people about what redistricting was and what's happening, assist and work very closely with the city clerk, and then advise council on how the process goes through a preliminary report and a final report. So the committee selection for those committee members is the city council appoints those 7 members. So our city council is divided of 9 seats, 3 of those at large, meaning they run citywide, and 6 district seats. And those 6 district seats, again, are what will be on your April 6, 2021 ballot. So that process, there was an advertisement, a request for nominations, really similar to what happened on the state side. We did have nominations. There was an interview process. What was good about the interview process is if you were a current city council district member and you were eligible to run for election, they appointed one of the other members to serve on the interview panel with the president of council and myself. In this case, of course, the president of council's own district seat is up for this election this year, so the president pro tem did those interviews with me. So again, those qualifications for those district process advisory members, they have to be registered electors in the city, and the council must strive for gender, racial, ethnic, age, geographic diversity of that committee as much as possible. And they cannot, this is the most important thing I believe on this committee, is they cannot then intend, or at least at the time they're serving, intend to run for that city council seat. Obviously, it would be very unfair for a candidate to be drawing and working and commenting on their own district. So we did put that qualification in the city code. So their requirements were to conduct one public meeting in each of the 6 districts to solicit input for the city clerk, prepare a preliminary report saying, here's all the public comment we got, here's what our recommendations are, here's how the process has gone. And then once the city clerk in between that releases the preliminary plan and the final plan, then they come back and report to council on how did the process work, are there any improvements. Now, that is in theory what should have happened. But, and these, I should say, this slide, if anyone's really interested, that's all the code sites and the charter section sites. So what really happened because of COVID, as we all know, those meetings within each district could not occur in person because those meetings were kind of April to summer, kind of right in the height of COVID. So what we did was virtual meetings for commenting. So we did have some attendees that were out of district, so to speak, that participated in those virtual meetings, which was fine. They also were allowed to comment at all. And comment in general. So they had 7 virtual meetings. One of the things that we did prior to those virtual meetings was the city clerk, myself, I should say, working with our GIS team, we developed 4 option maps. One of the things the committees recommended prior to going to these public meetings was it's really hard to educate the public on what redistricting is because it is a little bit convoluted when you go to talk about it, as you've heard in these 2 presentations. So they thought it would be simpler for the public to comment on draft maps, have something visual and written to look at to be able to say, sort of help tailor their commentary, not sway their commentary, but give them something to talk about. So I did, working with staff, with the committee's input, we did develop 4 option maps for them to take a look at how our 210 square mile city was divided into 6 districts. So we did produce those maps, and we did, that was the comment. They could also generally comment also, but we simply were not able to have those intended virtual meeting or in-person meetings because of the timing of when we were going. So we did put everything out on the city website. We had a special redistricting project plan where they could look at the maps, PDF of the maps, download the draft maps. There was also an ability to get online and through a live kind of GIS function, and I'm not a GIS person, so I'm insulting probably everyone in the geography department, sorry. They could go in and move those maps, look around, not just with a static map. The public comment, we accepted that any way we could get it, quite frankly. Online forms, emails, phone, mail, city offices were closed to the public at that point. So there wasn't any walk-in traffic to comment, but we did ask for comments in any way that someone was comfortable in providing that to us. The one thing I will say about this is we had a very difficult time getting the media to really take an interest, to put it politely, and to help us spread the word about these meetings and what we were doing. And again, part of that in their defense was everything was about COVID during this time and variation. So that was one thing that was a little bit of a struggle this time, is just getting the newspaper. The Gazette did write one article for us, but the TV, radio was just not very interested in ours. We did do a podcast about this topic, so it was a little tough really getting input. But one thing I do want to point out is we are on the city level, And our races are nonpartisan, so one of the things we were not looking at is, the party affiliation part of it. So the political parties weren't as interested in ours as they will be, obviously, in the statewide and the countywide redistricting processes. So what we really tried to do was get as much information as we could. The process committee was extremely helpful to me as city clerk because they lived in that district and they came from a wide variety of backgrounds and professions, and they had a wide variety of network connections. Their own Facebook page, Nextdoor was another big one that they used a lot. They were really vital for me in getting out there and spreading the word outside of the official city communications team. So we did get a lot of really good feedback from them. They were very interested, they were very involved. It's just a hard topic really to teach somebody in a very short time span that they had to operate, and I do believe you're going to have that on the state level also. It's a hard topic to wrap your head around, and so much of the rules to do redistricting are really buried in court cases. So it is kind of tough to be able to learn to do that. So these are the things that we really tried to do quite a bit of, and both on the preliminary map that the city clerk's required to release, which was after the public comments, and then in the final plan once we had, again, all of that public comment. So this is just a table that went along with the map. And so what I want to really kind of talk about here is you'll notice something called the ideal district size. And so really what that is you're taking your population, you're dividing it by the number of districts you have to create, and that gives you ideal size. So I've put the 2016 here because we do this every 4 years. So the 2016 is there just to show you the difference in the size of the districts and the growth in the population from 16 to 20. So you can see that the districts are fairly close in population, as close as you're really gonna get it, to be honest with you, and keep that laundry list that Dwayne listed about communities of interest and using major roadways and those kind of things to get there. So some of the things that I looked at in trying to determine, and I know this is the smallest map, but that is what our districts look like. So the gray pieces are pieces that are not within the city of Colorado Springs boundary. They might look like they are, but that big gray section in the middle, Cimarron Hills-ish area, is not within the city. So it is why it's gray. So let me just point out that what I used as the basic building block for drawing these districts was the county voting precincts, because those were defined territories that were easily seen and easily defined. So that is the small little sections, kind of odd-shaped sections, because there are state laws for the county clerk that they have to divide and can only be a certain size. So our county clerk, Chuck Browerman, probably did not choose to draw those boundaries the way they are. It's just you have to do certain things to not cross your state rep, your state senate, congressional, those kind of things. So what I did was look at the precincts. Then I also looked at HOAs. What are the defined HOAs? I should say the recognized HOAs. What are the recognized neighborhoods out there? What are the county commissioner districts? I did look at those. I looked a lot. This time, we focused a lot on school board boundaries. Because if you ask somebody today, what city council district, sometimes even maybe what county commissioner or state rep or whatever, the first thing they're going to tell you more than likely is, well, I'm in D11, school district 11. That's the one I know instantly. So what I tried to do, and I did do between my 2nd and 6th district, which is the purple and yellow, is that new boundary line between those districts is the dividing line between District 20 and District 11 schools. Prior to this time, it had been split. So I moved everything. The other thing that I did was District 5, which is in the center, that pinkish color, and District 6 again is yellow. I made the dividing line as far, District 5 goes as far east as Powers. Powers, everybody in the city knows Powers Boulevard. You can't miss it. It's huge. So that is a dividing line, because what I tried to use is major roadways that you can see with the naked eye, so to speak, what the boundary would be. So we ended up moving 20 precincts into different districts to equalize that population. As you can see, because the city limits is compact slightly, you do have, some little outlier areas and some recent annexations. The city's always annexing, but we had to take a kind of a freeze in time approach to be able to do that. So those are how we looked at communities of interest. We did also look at some affordable housing statistics, like where is the affordable housing. We did look at race as we went into this and tried to draw and adjust those boundaries. So what you're hearing from me really is what I did with the districts are tweaks. I tweaked the districts. We didn't throw out the entire map and say, hey, we're going to start from nothing and go back. We did decide to use the tweaks because some people actually do know who their council member is, and they know to some degree, they don't know the district boundary, but they in some cases know this member is my member. This is who I call. So we did try to do that. I did have this year the nice thing is I had 3 incumbents who could not run again because council members can only serve 2 back-to-back terms, so that's 8 years. So I took advantage of that and expanded District 5 to take in the Village 7 neighborhood. That area had previously had, at that point I did this, a sitting council member in there, but he was termed. So I took advantage of that and moved that district up where I'd been wanting to do for a while. But I felt comfortable doing it because he, in fact, was termed and he is now a state representative. So that's a little bit about taking what you heard in the first 2 presentations and kind of putting it into play in a real situation, if that helps at all. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have or, anything that you have for me. But so we have the district process committee that works with us, but again, the city clerk under charter does the districts, but we work together. There's no reason not to work together.
All right, we do have a few questions for you, Sarah. What tools or metrics were used to determine how diverse and representative that oversight committee was? Or was it district-specific representation that was?
It was district-specific representation. So we did advertise through a myriad of ways as best we could. The council members themselves also did advertise throughout their network. And the committee did take a look at, obviously, let me put it this way. We were confined by the people that applied, that met the qualifications. Then we made sure that we had equal representation as, on male-female. That one was the easier one. As far as the racial part of it, we didn't have a whole lot of minorities apply. We didn't have a whole lot of people apply. I shouldn't say that. We had 2 in every district. Some districts had 3. But once they learned of the time commitment and those kind of things and what was happening, we had some people kind of back out. But we did try as best that we could to try to get, the geography and to get people that live in different parts of those districts. So we already started off the bat with having to have 6 district representatives, and then the at-large was duplicate. So our at-large person ended up being in the 1st district.
So the next question is looking ahead towards the next redistricting cycle. What is the most effective way for a civilian to express their concerns and get involved in the redistricting process with the city? And how would you prefer to hear from citizens?
Well, I think we would all prefer not to have a pandemic, right? I do think that would be the number one goal. The other goal is check the city website, check in, welcome to contact my office. We'll be doing this again, obviously in 4 years. coming down. So the next set of at-large council races is 2023, and then of course the next set of these races is 25. So put it on your calendar, 2024, January, February-ish. Call the city clerk's office and, you know, try to contact on that. Really, if you have any media connections, could you please talk to them and tell them when the city clerk comes talking to them in 2024 to please help us out and use that. I tell you, one thing that we did a lot of was social media. I mean, honestly, we did every social media avenue out there through council side or through the city side to really spread the word out there. We had a lot more participation this time, even in a pandemic. In fact, I think we had better attendance at those meetings. But again, that was right in the heart of COVID, so we're not the best test case. But just try to remember 2024 City Council redistricting.
Great, Sarah. And what's the best way for interested citizens to get in touch with you?
Sure. You can certainly email at elections@coloradosprings.gov. You can call the office, 719-385-5901. You can come to our office. We're 30 South Nevada. Right behind the security guards is our office, Suite 101, which is just at the corner of Colorado and Nevada. You can certainly mail us, email us. City website, we have a contact link on that to the city clerk's office. But yeah, we welcome any input, and if you are a registered voter and you live in the city of Colorado Springs, stay tuned. You're going to see a lot and hear a lot from me. Most importantly, you're going to get a ballot. And guess what you're going to do with that ballot? Well, first of all, you're going to go to the mailbox because it's all mail ballot. I'm preaching to myself. I don't go to the mailbox that often either. You're going to go to your mailbox on March 12th. We're going to mail them. So 13th, 14th, get there. You're going to open it. You're going to read it. It's just one page. It's not like the county. We didn't, gratefully. And you're going to vote. You know, if you want to be engaged, you have an opinion, vote in every election you can vote in. If you have moved, if you are moving, get in there, go to govotecolorado.gov or .com. Keep your voter registration information updated, and just remember to vote no matter what the election is, who's conducting it, doesn't matter. Vote.
Fantastic, Sarah. Thank you. As the saying goes, all politics is local, right? So local elections are just as important as our national elections, so go vote. I'm going to stall here for a minute because we are going to wipe down the podium between speakers. So we will have a nice, long, lengthy introduction for our final speaker this evening. We are very fortunate to be joined by Rebecca Theobald. Ms. Theobald is an assistant research professor in the Geography and Environmental Studies Department here at UCCS. She directs the GeoCivics, which is an effort to ask geographic questions to address redistricting, and also emphasizes the role that geospatial technology plays in drawing electoral districts. Rebecca, we are excited to have you here tonight, and the microphone is yours.
Jared, you're going to have to give me some. Great. Well, really, first of all, I want to thank Shannon because she has been a huge part of this project and has just been with UCCS for a little over a month. So we are delighted to have her. And also, I appreciate all the experts here because they are thinking very hard about some very specific pieces of this process. I want to say at the outset that this is really a call to action. As a geographer, I want to remind us of the outsized influence that geospatial technology has had and will have on the drawing of electoral districts at the federal, state, and local levels. And that is really new in the past couple decades. We don't all have to become expert cartographers, but we should be prepared to examine proposed maps and ask questions about them. As Sarah said, you need to be involved, you need to vote, you need to read. So thanks to everyone for this information, and for providing a strong base of knowledge. So let's now consider what actions you might be able to take. So the Geocivics project grew out of work in classrooms across Colorado and was piloted in schools throughout the United States. These materials are appropriate for engaging with community members as well as with educators and students. The objective is to lay the groundwork for understanding key concepts of this, as we've already heard, rather unsexy process with presentations such as we have heard this evening. The good news is that redistricting education efforts are supported by a variety of disciplines, from geographers to mathematicians, political scientists, lawyers, and demographers. Remember that the first step in this process is the census. The objective of the census is to count everyone once in the right place. This year, the census looked a bit different than it did in 1930. And depending on your audience's knowledge of the process and their familiarity with the area being redistricted, you could jump right to a discussion of apportionment, or you could take the census data and explore population shifts to illustrate the data. For instance, we know that Colorado is a large state. We know that most people, including the future commissioners, will only know about a small part of the state. And we know that many changes have taken place in Colorado over the past decade. So there will be changes in how the lines will be drawn to create districts with equal population. This Coloradans on the Move activity provides a foundation for illuminating population movement. And if you have friends, family, or colleagues in other states, this activity is available for every state. Dates vary depending on the history of European settlement. And video is available on the Geocivics website to illustrate how the activity works on the giant map. But it's COVID, and maybe you don't have access to a giant map. So a paper map and small stackable items such as Legos or buttons works just as well. So we've heard about apportionment following the report of the census data. Apportionment will determine how the 435 members of the House of Representatives are divided among the 50 states based on total state population. And then we've heard about redistricting, which is how we determine which people vote together at any scale. And I think it was so helpful to hear about the Colorado Springs effort, because it's exactly the same process that will be done at the state level as was done at the city level. As Dwayne Liller discussed, we all need to understand the redistricting criteria for each area being divided. Federal, state, and local have different requirements, and different states have different requirements as well. These flashcards with brief explanations on the back illustrate a useful activity to give you a sense of these criteria. The cards allow you to review and prioritize and discuss what you think are the most important factors when deciding where to draw the lines. So we really need to think about how we want to address these issues. If you know how to analyze and manage the information, you can create districts that reflect the criteria you want to prioritize. Because map makers really are powerful. If you know the data and you know the criteria, then you will be able to make an assessment of whether the maps that are being created are fair. So these are tools that you can use to support your exploration of redistricting and drawing new maps. These are all linked from the Geocivics website. This is a sample of what Districtor looks like, and I encourage you to learn about other open source online redistricting map programs. So just as Sarah was showing you the precincts, you can see that there are different building blocks that cartographers use to create these maps. And it's not scary. You can go online, you can draw your own map and have an idea of what you would like to be your state senate, your state house, or your congressional district. What communities would you like to be in that map? So public involvement opportunities are mandated by Amendments Y and Z, but it's up to you to show up. Pay attention to when the meetings are scheduled in your congressional district. The good news, everyone can now have access to the data and to these accessible geospatial technology tools. So be prepared for this process. And I would like to encourage us to remember that achieving fair maps using the redistricting criteria will require compromise. We want to avoid these separate maps drawn by parties as being conflicting. You have the power as a member of your community to explain how your region is organized and what its needs are. And you want to communicate that both, I think, to your elected officials as well as to the commissioners who will be doing the work of mapping the state. And I would like to let us use discussions about redistricting to demonstrate to people with different viewpoints can come together to agree on what constitutes fair maps. In this time of division, we really need to show that we can manage some compromise and some civil discussion about civic issues. So think about what you might want to do. There are a variety of approaches. Not everybody has to become an expert cartographer and present a map. You could testify before the Independent Redistricting Commission. You could send them a communication via email. You could simply have this conversation with friends, family, colleagues, remind them that this activity is happening and they should be a part of it. So here are a number of resources that you can find, and again, we'll have this presentation available so you can see these resources. And we're ready to answer any additional questions and have discussion. And we're really ready to support your work in classrooms or community organizations. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your comments. Before we move to general questions and answers, I just want to give a very quick thank you to a few people who made tonight possible. Stephanie Adams at UCCS Downtown, who has been a fantastic host. Jared, our technology wizard, who somehow is bringing 7 laptops together to get what you're seeing on the screen. It's truly impressive. And then, of course, our student volunteer, Sydney, who has been fielding your questions all night long in the chat and is hopefully fielding some right now. We are going to open it up to questions, so please feel free to submit to any of the speakers on any of the topics that you've heard from tonight. If there's any topics or issues that you need some clarification on, now is the time. While we're waiting for those to come in, I would like to just echo Rebecca's comments that getting involved is important, but of course this is a large and sometimes complicated topic to wrap your arms around. In the spirit of helping to further demystify the issue of redistricting, we are looking to have an additional event, kind of a 201 if you will, to further discuss issues related to electoral redistricting. So please be on the lookout for that. We'll be sure to send that to you as soon as we have it on the calendar. Cindy, do we have any additional questions? Great. Thank you. All right. Is incumbent protection still a valuable learning piece? I think that's probably best directed to either Dwayne or Jeremiah. Is incumbent protection still a valuable learning piece?
Oh, Sarah, actually, please feel free. That would be lovely. While they're formulating their responses,
To some degree, I think it does play into it. In my previous role, back in my home state, working on state redistricting, as mentioned earlier, depending on what party was in control in those states, you would see the districts drawn to where you would purposely have. I did see one where there were 4 members of the minority party placed into one district so they could reduce their numbers and gain more seats by the majority. So I think in those states that don't have the Colorado setup, which we're about to see how that works, and even my local side, I do think it's something to think about. in that respect. I know, as you heard me say on mine, I took advantage of an incumbent who could not run again to move a district the way I wanted to, because I just did not feel like in previous redistricting to purposely move an incumbent out unless I had a justifiable reason. If it was to keep a community of interest together, if it was to move a district to a better, more visual boundary, or to unite a divided community of interest, then I think you can certainly go down that road if that helps answer that question at all.
I guess I would just say that I think traditionally it has certainly been an area that redistrictors relied on and tried not to pin two or more incumbents in the same district. My previous work with the reapportionment commissions, although that I don't think was specifically listed as a criteria in the Constitution. I think that's something that they tried to do. And I'm not certain that the new language in the Colorado Constitution that says no district shall be drawn to, favor or disfavor an incumbent. I'm not certain. I think they will still try to draw the districts to keep incumbents away from having to run against each other. I think there is something to be said for having the voters to vote someone out rather than having someone ousted because of redistricting. I know in Colorado, unfortunately, there was a gentleman from Eastern Colorado who was put in the same district as another member of his caucus in both 2001 and 2011. So each time, because we do have term limits, eventually he was able to get back into the legislature, but because of the changing population, especially on the eastern plains in Colorado, he ended up being drawn into another member's district in successive redistricting cycles. So I think it's something that you can try to avoid without necessarily favoring an incumbent over the candidate. I think it may depend on how you draw the rest of the district around them. So.
Thank you, Jeremiah. Dwayne, did you have any thoughts that you wanted to share as well on that topic?
I do not on that topic.
Fantastic.
Are there any other questions, Sydney? No? All right, well, with that, we just want to all thank these four fabulous panelists, Jeremiah, Dwayne, Sarah, Rebecca. We truly appreciate your expertise and the time that you've shared with us. And most importantly, we want to thank everyone who's joined us tonight for Electoral Redistricting 101. We'll be sending out some information via email with links to where you can find the taped version of this program as well as the slide deck. And we welcome your questions and your comments. That would be especially helpful as we prepare for Electoral Redistricting 201. Thank you all so much for joining us and have a wonderful night.